Welcome back to Lean Blog Interviews. I'm Mark Raven, and our guest today is Ward Vuillemot. He is a seasoned C-suite executive. He has over 6 years of time leading fully remote teams while building technology organizations from the ground up. That's with companies ranging from 150 to 650 employees and revenues ranging from about 50 to 125 million. He's been doing that across the Americas and in Europe. He is currently the Chief Product Officer and Chief Technology Officer at RealSelf, and he is a technical advisor through his own company. His website is wardvuillemot.com. I'll put a link to that in the show notes so we don't have to take time spelling it. It's a long name, but it's there in the show notes. Ward advises startup founders and CEOs on their technical roadmaps and their technology organizations along with lean approaches. That's why he's here. Ward, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. It's great to be back.
Yeah. And when Ward says be back, we recorded an episode of My Favorite Mistake back in November, episode 195. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And for those who are listening, this is the thing that Zoom does to you. When I made the comment about the spelling of his name, Ward was smiling and chuckling, but I don't think it came through in the audio. So just so you know, he wasn't shooting me a glare or anything.
My last name in particular trips up a lot of people, and depending on with family member and where they are in the country, I think a lot of people think it's spelled differently. So it's a tricky one.
But I've got the pronunciation and I think the spelling down.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I do, we had a great conversation on My Favorite Mistake, and I encourage people to go check out both stories. We got a bonus story from Ward about favorite mistake, and there's going to be some overlap where today, I originally, when Ward and I talked about doing a podcast together, it turned out to be both. But I think the overlap in topic is something Ward has developed and used and written about called celebration of errors. So we will get into that, but normally we start off here on the Lean podcast with a bit of origin story time. So Ward, kind of tell the audience here, tell us how you first got exposed to Lean, what was some of the context and why did it, what's your story? Yeah.
Yes. So it's an interesting sort of circuitous route that actually starts on the proverbial knee of my father. My father spent time in Japan, actually during the military between wars, but he fell in love with Japan, and as a consequence, as a professional, at some point, he was very much engrossed in total quality management, TQM.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was very young, let's say pre-teens, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, I was reading the books on TQM and that management style. And those were the conversations that he and I had around the, again, not quite literal dinner table. So I was very much engrossed in that thinking from a very early age, then spent time in Japan, studied there, ended up being a technical Japanese interpreter for Boeing. Where I originally had been employed as an aerospace engineer, but for a while, people might know Shingujutsu in the industry as Lean consultants. They worked and probably still are working with Boeing on the Boeing production system, similar, analogous to the Toyota production system. So I was the first full-time employee employed by RealSelf as a Japanese interpreter, and because I am trained as a technical Japanese interpreter, I read, write, and speak at a technical level, like at an engineering level, not grammatically technical, though I guess maybe it is, but like I'm conversant at that technical level. It was a good fit for me. And so I spent really the one full year on the proverbial knee of Shingujutsu Consultants, going around all of Boeing's facilities in North America and Australia, doing Kaizen workshops. So pretty much being engrossed in it 5 days, 6 days a week, for 10 hours a day for, upwards of 52 weeks. And so that was really when I got dumped back into Lean. Again, in a lot of instances, I'd have entire days by myself with the consultants. And when they realized, on top of being able to speak Japanese, I was also an aerospace engineer. I spent a lot of time just getting very one-on-one instruction from them. And I ended up leaving that and going back to now, I said aerospace engineering, but I've been programming since I'm 5. I've been doing this for 45 years, so you can date myself. But I I was really always doing computational engineering, even when I was at Boeing. So I moved back into software engineering. I was really within the aerospace discipline. I was doing a lot of software development. And so I really got engrossed into agile development, which I would argue is really just an offshoot of Lean. And I was getting into it in the early 2000s, right around the time Agile Manifesto came out, which I wouldn't say I was one of the original signers, but I was one of the very early signers of that, and ended up introducing Agile methodology to the Boeing commercial aviation, or BCA, division at the time. And at that time, there was really no one doing anything agile. It was very waterfall, very well planned, and sort of taking a different approach to software development, as an example. So I ended up, as a consequence, introducing those concepts to BCA, starting a team, building a product, and eventually realized I really wanted to go even further in it and be more with what I would argue is my tribe of folks, which is much more incremental, iterative approach, and sort of learn as you go and embrace your ignorance and be open to making mistakes, using the mistakes as your vehicle for learning. And so I left Boeing and went to Amazon, and helped the then startup that we know as Amazon Fresh. I think most people know of Amazon Fresh now nationally, but for a long time we were just a small pilot program, about 40 of us who didn't know better. And so that's where I sort of continue to cut my teeth and continue to sort of advocate for Lean. So that's sort of my origin story. And then since then, it's been a long sort of career of being very much in what we call 0 to 1 space. So in tech space, we talk about 0 to 1, which is starting from nothing to getting to an initial product. And so I've spent most of my career, whether it was at Amazon or even Xbox, you could argue Xbox One was a 0 to 1, to working at the Azure incubation group with Techstars, which is an incubation incubator group, similar to Y Combinator. Some people are probably familiar with Y Combinator, to creating greenfield products for large, big and small companies, including now at much smaller companies. So
yeah. Well, thank you for that. Maybe we can go back a couple follow-up questions, to the origin story. So there's similarities where I first got exposed to Deming and his books because of my dad, who was working at General Motors as an engineer, and went to one of the famed 4-day Deming workshops. So I was going to ask you, was your dad also Boeing or Aerospace, or what?
No, yeah, I am familiar with Deming too. That's amazing if you got to go to a workshop. No, my father was working for a small company at the time, Welch Allen, out of central New York. They make medical equipment, borescopes and endoscopes, fiber optics, the rest of that. And so he was an operations manager, and it was focused on the manufacturing and the repair of medical equipment.
Yeah. And do you remember, did he also have a Deming book on his shelf, or did you?
Most definitely. Yep.
Later. Yeah.
No. Deming and all that entire history for me was sort of growing up. I think Deming being sort of, arguably even in Japan, really the godfather of what we think of as Lean today.
And Toyota, even in recent years, still gives credit or pays homage, however you might say that, to how important Deming philosophy is to their management system. So you got all that time with Shingujutsu, and so I'm sure, gosh, I mean, there's probably an hour's worth of stories from all of that. Well, here, let me ask you a question first, like being pedantic maybe about pronunciation or language. I don't claim that. I'm sure there's some of these Japanese Lean words that I mispronounce. Is there one in particular that's like nails on the chalkboard to you? If you could give us friendly advice of like, stop mispronouncing, is there one that comes to mind? Maybe?
No, I think no. I mean, it gets into the pedanticness of like Andon versus Andon. That's probably the only one. It's not chalk. To me, it doesn't bother me because I as an as an interpreter and just recognizing like, hey, there's dialect and that's how people pronounce it. And for people in the conversation, everyone gets it. Um, I, that's the only one I can think of that sort of stands out as people. And then Kanban is one that sort of that's a little bit more because a lot of people say Kanban. For me, it's Kanban, and so Kanban to me it sounds very different. And that one is a little harder for me to like make that intuitive leap is like, oh, that's what they're talking about. Like that's probably it's not like fingers on the chalkboard, but I sometimes just have to slow down and go, oh, they mean like in my head, I'll sort of self-correct and go, okay, that's what they're talking about because it doesn't immediately translate for me for whatever reason.
Yeah.
So
I think that's sort of a Northeastern thing when I hear Kanban.
Yeah.
So maybe back to more substantive issues. I mean, that time with the Shingujutsu sensei. I mean, is there anything that stands out to you, whether it was through the events or that one-on-one time, like something you remember that was like really surprising or counterintuitive that they taught you?
I think it took me time, and I think even years later, there's a level of human-centric design to the Toyota production system that I think oftentimes goes underappreciated by even people who are devotees of Lean and Toyota in particular, and how much it's really centric on a very democratized form of leadership. And so to imbue your company with Lean, like everything else, isn't just a bunch of methodology and process. It's a culture shift that is, I think, really hard to articulate to folks that you can't just mimic these things and expect to get the same results unless you're also willing to adopt some really deep-seated and deep-held beliefs around how you operate, how you think about leadership, and what your roles are within organizations.
Yeah.
So much of Lean is sort of like, managers manage abnormality, right? The employees processes manage normality, right? It speaks to a conviction around the roles and responsibilities of contributors in your organization up and down. It's, how much of Lean is about the top listening down, like your people on the closest to your customer actually know the ground truth better than you as an executive. So your job is to listen to them. And so the communications is always coming up from the bottom, right? Which is a cultural conceit or a cultural norm versus, in the West, we have very much of that top down. Our job is to yell at our employees at the bottom, that theory, the theory X, they're lazy, so you have to like really appreciate, that's the piece I really try to harp on is it's all about culture. I was recently doing some consulting for someone in Switzerland, and they're asking me about, what sorry, I was going to use some acronyms that the audience might not know, but continuous integration, continuous deployment that we use in software as an example, and how we do the software development life cycle. And I kept on just coming back to like, well, it depends on these things. And he basically said, these are all culture notes. Like these are all cultural. And it says, exactly. Every decision you make about your software development cycle, your continuous integration, your environments, your development environment, your tooling, everything, your hiring process, it's an expression of culture. So understand your culture and work back from there. I can't tell you to adopt this process if you don't have this culture, because I can tell you which processes don't align well with certain cultural norms.
Right.
So that's the biggest piece I think around Lean, and it's very human centric. It's a very beautiful, very practical expression of a love for craft and a love for craftspeople that I think really goes underappreciated, particularly in the United States manufacturing that I have seen. I'm not saying everyone, but I think that's probably the general majority.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we go back to the word, I'm going to say it. I have a habit of saying Andon. Andon. Is that better?
Andon, but yeah.
Okay. Andon. Sorry.
It's okay. Don't worry. Don't get self-conscious. So I don't like to correct people or tell, because I don't want you to get self-conscious about something.
Okay. So I'll stop doing that. So, but if we think of Andon as equipment, Andon cords or buttons and lights and chimes and boards. And I mean, somebody could copy Toyota and install those things, but without a culture, and I want to explore this more, whether it's around mistakes or errors, like as you
Yeah.
put it so well, using mistakes as a vehicle for learning. If the culture is the yelling, blaming, punishment model, it's very predictable that people won't pull the Andon cord.
Yeah.
Right. So and
Absolutely.
got to have that seems like one of those really important cultural elements that you have to have.
Yeah, it's the same thing with, you hear more often, you get what you measure, right? You've heard that probably, we've all heard that phrase, and we know in whether it's lean or not, but lean is very much like appreciates this. It's same thing as how you behave or how you react. You also get, right? That also informs the response. So what you measure, how you behave will inform how the people around you will interact with that. So that inciting incident, right? That Andon and how you behave to it will then follow through on subsequent interactions. And what you're trying to do, to your point, is to normalize the right behavior. Right. We don't want people to hide it. I mean, it's the entire point of shining a light on it. That's what the Andon is like that lantern, that beacon to say, here I am. You don't want people to, I know people listening can't see, I just put my hands in front of my eyes, but don't want to hide from it. You want everyone to stop and look at it and go, oh, here I am, here you are. Let me go, let's go and race to that and figure that out. And so that's the behavior you want to encourage. So you got to really appreciate, you got to make sure, which gets deeper into something that we talked about in the previous podcast, but I think is actually, again, because everything you do is a note to the cultural norms you want. I talk a lot about, in my space, psychological safety. And how do you get people to step into psychological safety, which is fundamental to, I would argue, any process, any framework, but specifically to lean is fundamental to lean is psychological safety.
Yes.
Because you're trying to enculturate the norms around it's okay to make a mistake, because the mistake is a doorway into learning, and learning is where innovation and improvements happen. So, and again, that's your ignorance, right? That's why I always say I'm comfortable with my ignorance, because I understand my ignorance is where opportunity exists, whether it's in a form of improvement or in form of innovation. So yeah, I mean, lean is all about that. It's all about heart. That's what I love about lean. And I know I'll probably say something somewhat incendiary to some of the audience. It's why I'm not a huge fan of Six Sigma, or I see Six Sigma as a tool, because I think Six Sigma to me can sometimes be, and I'm ignorant, so I'm from the outside. It's one of the reasons why I haven't pursued Six Sigma, because I do have this opinion, but it tends to cleave itself. It's seen as more of a quantitative analysis and reduces a very human element of any system, production, manufacturing, otherwise, into a bunch of numbers. And I think it misses the deeper philosophical notes in lean. Now that's me. Obviously, I tend to lean towards things that really resonate with me. And I'm a very quant person. I come from applied mathematics and, computational fluid dynamics. So I love quant. I just don't like to apply it the way I have seen Six Sigma applied. So again, for people who are listening, if you want to talk about that offline, you know how to reach me, wardvillemot.com. I'd love to have that conversation. But again, I'm not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater with Six Sigma. I think it has its place, but I think I see that more as a tool, not a philosophy. Whereas I think lean is more, as much a philosophy, if not more so, than a tool set and a framework of thinking.
Yeah. I mean, you're not going to get an argument from me on that. I agree. That's my experience when I was in manufacturing of, kind of seeing lean and Six Sigma coexist. You're right. Six Sigma, I would summarize, quantitative focus, project oriented, a handful of experts being tasked with improvement, as opposed to involving everybody in Kaizen. So that again, are there Six Sigma organizations that engage everybody in improvement? Probably, but I think it's hard. I think it's easier to describe a quote unquote lean culture than it would be to describe a quote unquote Six Sigma culture. Are people describing GE of the Jack Welch days, which is a very different environment than the last 4 years under Larry Culp's leadership as CEO. They really are working on a lean culture. But like you said, I mean, I wrote a book about statistical process control. I mean, there's nothing wrong with statistical methods, but I think you use them in the context of, I would prefer this lean culture that has psychological safety. Like I think it's implicit Toyota actually in the book Toyota Culture, it's kind of secondhand, directly references psychological safety, but I think you can see it implicit, even if it's not explicitly discussed. The psychological safety to pull the Andon cord, to
Yeah.
address the real reality, to run an experiment, like that all does require a high level of safety. Where, like you said, it's fundamental to lean. When companies try to copy lean methods without that foundation of psychological safety, like I just wouldn't believe a hypothesis that said lean was going to be effective here.
I absolutely agree. And it's interesting. Like you make an interesting point too around psychological safety. It's for you and I and for the audience, obviously, we're going to use some psychological safety because that's important for us to have a conversation about. But it's really important as leaders to recognize psychological safety isn't two words. It's actually embodied through a bunch of behaviors. And you don't have to use the word psychological safety anywhere in your company to have psychological safety.
Right.
But you could talk about it and guaranteed not have it. Right. But not talking about it
Right.
does not guarantee that you don't have it. Right. Does that make sense? And so
It makes
like
total sense.
when I joined like RealSelf, I introduced, the celebration of errors, which actually I stole from at least Amazon. Amazon might have stole it from somewhere else. There's nothing wrong with stealing, right? And it was known as a correction of errors. There's a lot like that I liked about it. There's a lot that I didn't like about it, or at least I felt like Amazon had lost the way on the sort of the subtle cultural pieces that a COE could create or not create if used correctly or incorrectly. And so for the first thing I did, actually before I even joined, like I want they had these incident reports. It's like, I'm done with incident reports. I don't want to see incident reports. I want to see a COE. Here's a COE. Here's how you do it. And they're like, well, it looks like an incident report. It's like, it's not really an incident report. Yes, there's a part of the incident reports in it, the root cause and the rest of it, but it's different. And I did that intentionally because I think a COE is one means to create behavioral or norms that in hindsight, a lot of people would turn around and go, oh, I feel psychologically safe because the way we use a COE broadly throughout the company is to create an environment where people feel safe to fail, that it's okay to shine a light on their mistakes and bring it to the weekly business review or the monthly business review or whatever and sort of say, hey, something broke and I need everyone to know about it. And it had a pretty big impact and it impacted 1 million users and we lost, $100,000 of potential revenue or direct revenue as a consequence of this. And no one is getting yelled for that, right? You don't talk about psychologically for the first year, but it's you sort of turn around and people start talking about, we have a lot of psychological safety at this company.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's when you sort of know you at least have the seed of psychological safety planted and growing. But if I had just come into the company as an executive and say, we're going to do psychological safety and you're going to feel psychologically safe, aren't you? Like they're they're just nod their heads and say, sure, whatever I need to make you shut up and go away. And so I think that's an important note.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of this seems to come back to mindset and tone, where the phrase incident report could be like fairly neutral. I think the way Toyota people use the word problem, like, okay, there is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's a noun. It's a fact. It exists. Let's deal with it.
Yeah.
Where in some companies, my gosh, like even in trying to get started with continuous improvement, some people really tense up and say, can we use any word other than problem? Like, well, the
problem, defect. Yeah, you get into this like 1984 Orwellian world of like, let's just. I remember at Boeing, I introduced a tool called Bugzilla, and I started talking about defects and like, some of the terminology like defect injection. And I remember one of my peer engineers got really upset with me and took me to task. And he's like, I don't make mistakes. It's not a defect. It was all around like. It wasn't a rational conversation. And I'm autistic, so at that point in my life, I didn't know how to have the emotional conversation that I needed to have with the individual. I was coming from the sort of to your point, like the word is defect. We can call it a bug. We can call it a lot of things, but it is what it is. I can't like sugarcoat and sort of say, hey, I'm not saying you're a defect. I'm not saying your behavior is a defect, but as a consequence, of decisions you made. It did create a defect, and we're just here to, like, I didn't know how to have that in a way that would bring them along for the journey. But yeah, it's amazing. So that's another piece of it, is like learning how to help people through that. And that's sort of the joke. Like, one of my titles is CTO, Chief Technology Officer, but the joke is it's Chief Therapy Officer. And I say that with all love, because
Right.
we all need some therapy. We all need some
Mhm.
love. And so much of my job, especially as an executive at a company, is to go around and help people feel safe stepping into themselves,
Mhm.
right? It's okay to be a work in progress,
Yeah.
and for your work to itself be a work in progress. And that's an interest, but it's an interesting piece. Like, you have to really, I think, address those kinds of cultural norms where it's, oh,
Mhm.
let's talk about the mistakes in a way that isn't about you, right? Like, that's
Right.
Lean's always like, it's not the process, it's not
Mhm.
the people, but it's the process that made the mistake. Focus on the process, right? In
Right.
some ways, it's sort of saying humans, and we all, I always tell my folks, like, I know you didn't mean to make a mistake. Like,
Right.
yes, I'm sure I can go out into the world and find employees who intentionally do things that's nefarious, that's malicious,
Right.
that's fireable, right? That's a
That's
different conversation.
that's
That's
sabotage.
that's sabotage. Yeah, I think you've used that word before. That's
Yeah.
sabotage.
Yeah.
We're not talking about sabotage. If we were, I'd have security and it would be a very quick
Right.
conversation and I wouldn't talk to you again. We're not talking about
Mhm.
sabotage here. I know you didn't mean to do that, but somehow our process, somehow our tooling, somehow our communications led to you being coincident with a defect. How do we improve the processes such that that doesn't happen again? And so they sort of take the human out of the conversation and put it back on the process.
Yeah.
I think is again, a really smart, like, very savvy way for people to sort of like to de-weaponize
Mm.
what is oftentimes a very, especially in the beginning, where people, we're in a world where we're supposed to be experts and always know the answers. And I think especially for highly educated folks, it can be really hard in the beginning to sort of say, hey, I made a mistake, because you're sort of like, I am paid not to make mistakes. Am I going to lose my job over this? And which I can get the mindset, but you have to teach people to think differently, feel differently.
Yeah. Well, and it's about that leader response, and I think when you're spot on when you talk about actions that help build that feeling of psychological safety. Tim Clark, who I've learned a lot from, and is really influential on me, describes the need for leaders to model vulnerable acts, like
Yep.
saying, I was wrong, I don't know, I made a mistake, or like, that leaders have to
They
lead,
they
and then when people try to follow, you have to reward. So you model and
Yep.
reward those acts. So if people have their scars and wounds of like, I can't admit a mistake because I might, God, I'm going to get punished. Like, you can't just snap your fingers and say, hey, it's safe now, don't feel that way. You have to bring them through it. And I
You have
think
to
when leaders can be honest and admit mistakes,
I
that's
think
sort of demonstrating what you're hoping others would do. And then when they try, gosh, you better reward them for it, which is, that word reward is similar to celebrate
mhm.
in its
It
connotation.
is. It is. Yeah, to celebrate, to reward, to acknowledge,
Yeah.
even to honor,
Mm.
to have grace.
Hmm.
I didn't really appreciate until I think I was in these positions as sort of like senior executives at companies, is how important culture and organizational behavior really is modeled from the top.
Yeah.
It's important to have advocates throughout your organization, but if the top leadership is playing only lip service to it, it will never ever get adopted. I've seen this over and over and over again. The best behaviors and the worst behaviors always get mimicked, and they get mimicked from the top. Everyone takes their notes from the top. So that is the most important change agent at a company, and it's the one that requires the most vulnerability, the most openness to
Hmm.
make mistakes, to own them. And I completely agree that it's super, super important for all of us. And I try to teach all my leaders, like, be vulnerable. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to have a bad day.
Hmm.
Sometimes I go into a meeting, I've gotten a lot better about it, but it's
Hmm.
sort of like, hey, I'm a little tired today. I
Yeah.
might be a little grumpy. If
Yeah.
I snip at you, I apologize.
Yeah.
Or if in the middle I sort of lose my proverbial stuff
Yeah.
in a meeting, which doesn't happen a lot, but let's say once a year, I'm just having a
Yeah.
really bad day. I'll just pause and go, wow, I really lost it there, didn't I?
Yeah.
I'm really sorry. And if I can, I go, what, I'll sort of go back to what I'm really, here's what I'm really trying to communicate. Yes, I'm upset. I need to think about this some more. You know, let's take 24 hours. I need an hour. Sometimes I can, but it's recovery from that and
Yeah.
really ask for grace from others and just say, it's okay to be human. I think that's the piece that I dislike. I was going to use the word hate. I'll probably say hate around a certain cultural norm or professional norm that we have is somehow, this is me, this is my values. So
Yeah.
not everyone will share this, but because I'm autistic, I find it very hard to ape mannerisms that aren't genuine to me or authentic to me.
Mhm.
So I cannot communicate in a way that isn't true to me. Like it literally just makes me physically, emotionally like distraught, irritable, angry, enraged,
Mhm.
like just not able to do it in a healthy way.
Mhm.
So it's hard for me to show up at work and behave in a way that isn't consistent with the way I would behave personally.
Mhm.
And and as a the fact of the matter is like I'm not the perfect human being outside of work. So I can't come to work and be something that I'm not, which is an imperfect human being. And I think we have too much of a adherence to a professional self versus personal self. And that professional self is sort of this very trimmed up, always has everything buttoned up, has all the right answers, is never wrong, is very confident. And I think it's harmful, even toxic when taken to
Mhm.
the extreme. And, learning to be self-aware, self-actualized, be accountable, but also be transparent, and be vulnerable, I think to me is a very important aspect of
Yeah.
myself that I bring to work and I ask my employees to. And that's me. Again, there
Mhm.
might be other leaders with other companies and people will be like, I don't want to be around Ward, but like just from my view,
Mhm.
from the outside when I see those kinds of folks behaving that way, there's a part of me that sort of breaks and wants to give them a hug and just say, you can
Yeah.
be you. Like you don't have to pretend to be something you're not. It's okay. I'm not judging you here. And that's the other piece, right? That's another key word. We talked about, celebrate, but non-judgmental,
Mhm.
right? It's psychological safety is about honoring the truth,
Right.
not judging the truth, like just respecting it for what it is. And it always be a, what can we do going forward
Right.
perspective. It's very sort of practical, right? It's not like you don't get into the shoulds. We should have done that. It's yes, we could have done something different. We will do something different based on that learning, but we don't use like trigger words for me like should, which is a
Right.
judgment, right? That is passive aggressive. It's toxic. It's not useful. It's not constructive. It's counter to asking the person the next time to come to you with a problem.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, you should have done that. Okay. The person sort of going, okay, you're judging me, and next time I'll maybe
Mhm.
hide this from you.
Yeah.
you know that's what
Yeah.
you've taught them in that moment. You haven't like scared them into like doing things right. You've just sort of taught them to hide from you, like
Right.
just by using the word
Right.
should. That's how powerful the word should
Yeah.
is,
And
as an
and
example.
what kind of stress or anxiety or other ill effects does that lead to? Like you see that
Hmm.
being really harmful. You talk about being your authentic self. I'll go back to Tim Clark again in his 4 stages of psychological safety framework. Stage 1 is really all around inclusion. Do you feel accepted? Do you feel respected? I love he uses this phrase. Is it inexpensive to be yourself?
Hmm.
Just this kind of just comfort level of do people accept you? Now, on the other hand, and this is not being critical of you, but being your authentic self. If you were losing your stuff every single day, and you were
Right.
to say, but that's me, that's my authentic self, that might be a leader. Again, I'm not pointing this at you, but a leader
Yep.
who is doing that and saying, well, I'm being authentically me, that's good for psychological safety. Well, that might be true for that leader, but not for everybody else. They
No, I
might,
mean
you know
it's no, I agree with you. And I think this is a really important point. It almost goes back to you get what you measure, right? Like almost every metric that you have, you always have to have two metrics minimally to counterpose each other.
yeah.
So like in the definition of being authentic, it needs to optimize for everyone being authentic, not
Right.
just one
Right.
individual. It's
Yeah.
a bit like nonviolent communications talks about. Like the interesting thing, let's take a side on nonviolent communications. One, misnomer, it doesn't mean that you don't get to yell. Like, so me having a bad day and raising my voice isn't necessarily violent communications if the person on the other side is heart-centered and still feels like they can be their authentic self. We
Mhm.
still haven't like violated the nonviolent communications creed. We haven't actually created a toxic environment. Now, if I do anything that makes you, Mark, step away from your authentic self,
Mhm.
then I have intentionally, unintentionally created an opportunity to created a toxic situation,
Right.
right? So it, there's a lot of things that we can be doing, and so it's always a negotiation of how we interact with people. There's the
Mhm.
obvious notes. Raising voice is probably going to be a trigger for some people,
Mhm.
especially if they're not your peers in the organization, right? I can
Mhm.
probably raise my voice and be a little bit more closer to the emotions with, Jeff, my CEO. But if I went to a person who reports to me, I'm punching down, right?
Mhm.
Like I shouldn't
Right.
do that. Like that's
Right.
definitely not acceptable to behavior. So it's situational.
Right.
It's depending on all parties. But your point being, and what I loved was, is that being your authentic self is low cost or ideally free, right?
Mhm.
As long as everyone feels like, hey, I can still be in this meeting and it's pretty free for me just to be me. If you need to yell, that's fine. But if the person feels like they have to close up, then
Mhm.
whatever my behavior was violates that sort of implicit agreement that
Right.
we're all trying to be all of ourselves, be authentic.
Right.
So
Yeah.
so that's the piece. And that's the piece where you can still say, hey, I was being authentic, but that's where I maybe need to learn how to grow to allow more people around me to also be simultaneously
Mhm.
authentic. And as a leader, it's entirely on you to go figure that out.
Yeah.
Um,
I
and
mean,
that's hard work, right? Like we're all works in progress. So
right. That's true. Myself included, especially. So, but one thing I'll celebrate though, with your story, Ward, of occasionally, getting upset, and you have the awareness to call it out, to apologize, and it sounds implicit, but giving permission seems like it would be helpful to give others permission to call you out on it.
absolutely.
Say, hey,
Absolutely.
if I'm getting upset, and like, hey, it's safe to say, hey, calm down, or telling someone to not be upset sometimes only makes them more upset. But to call out to a leader in a lot of organizations, that would be an extremely unsafe thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's important. It was it. I think you and I talked about the framework around psychological safety and the stages of psychological
Mhm.
safety, which I think you're sort of alluding to, and I completely agree with, and I really like that framework. Unfortunately, I can't call it out direct. I know you could,
No, it's
but
okay.
maybe we could explore that. But
Yeah.
again, it's there's a maturity model you can apply to psychological safety, and I think
Right.
leaders need to recognize, hey, everyone needs to feel psychological safety, and that includes being able to give critique. Like I need to be feel for you to give critique or insight or observation to my folks, but they conversely need to be able to feel equally free to come to me and hold me accountable and say, hey, you missed the mark here and there. It could be behavioral, it could be decision
Mhm.
making, it could be because we're trying to optimize for learning here. We're not trying to
Mhm.
optimize necessarily for the leaders to feel good about themselves, right? And
Right.
that's I think the piece about like it's deep work. This is hard work.
Yeah.
And I think that's why a lot of people don't do it because it really requires a degree of self-awareness and a self-actualization at every level in every employee, and it takes a lot of work. And I understand why people resort to shortcuts and get a very sort of annuity, what I would say annuity based, very short term. I'm going to squeeze value out of Mark. You're probably going to leave me in 2 years, but I don't
Mhm.
care because I'm just going to you're going to leave or I'm going to fire you and I'm going to just replace you. And honestly, that was the considered approach and opinion of Amazon when I was there. It was squeeze, get the juice. If you could continue to give juice after 2 or 3 years, great. If not, there's always more. There's more oranges and fruits, and it
Yeah.
was that was a philosophical decision. It was whether I agree with it or disagree with it. It was very advantageous to them for a while, right? Because they were very much sort of cost, and they were trying to get the most value. Now, if you take a different view, which I do, which is the annuity based, I'm going to be with you, Mark, for the rest of our lives,
Mhm.
right? And as long as you want to be with me, I always tell my folks, even if you're leaving the company, you're still with me. If you ever need me, anytime in the future, come to me. I will open doors for you. I will make references for you. I will sit and talk to you about anything. Like you and I'm taking a lifelong commitment the moment you and I work with each other. So I take the very, very, very lifelong view with every
Yeah.
person I have an interaction with. I think that's the right view. But again, it takes more energy from me.
Mhm.
It'd probably be easier for me to just walk into rooms and pound a table and say, gosh darn it, why isn't it done? Probably wouldn't use those words if I was slamming the table. You know what I mean? But
Right.
we'll try to keep it PG here.
Yeah.
It would be easier. in some ways, I could be selfish and just sort of say, I'm going to maximize the cost to me, or I'm going to minimize the cost to me and maximize the outputs for me, and I'm just going to squeeze everyone around me. And I get some why people do it. I don't agree with it, but
Right.
it is a considered opinion, and it isn't from weak people. Sometimes it's from very strong
Mhm.
people who are just very, very practical and sort of feel like they don't want to own that portion of the relationship with you, and they're just not going to operate that way. I always tell people is you can self-select in just as easily as you can self-select out.
Mhm.
Find your people, and that's the last Peter on culture. I always say, like, I tell you how I operate. And it might, I guarantee there's probably people listening to this, maybe not this group, but I'm sure there's people out in the world that they heard me, they'd be like, I would not want to work for Word.
Oh.
I just want to come to work,
Oh.
do my job. If you got to yell at me, that's cool. I don't care about any of this other stuff. I don't need you to be vulnerable with me. I don't need you to be talking about love and accountability. That's not what I'm here for. Just give me a paycheck. I'll do my job, and I'd be like, that's great. I don't want you here, but not because you're not an amazing human being, but you wouldn't be an amazing fit for what we're trying to achieve here. And I think that's lean.
Yeah.
To me, what we embody at RealSelf is like fundamentally a lean concept, at least has the foundations of lean in that sense from a cultural perspective.
That sounds familiar, like for whatever position I'm in I'm not trying to judge, but it sounds
Yeah.
familiar. We're we've had this conversation here that's really about, mindsets and behaviors and cultures. I mean, people can go online and read about the COE template, right?
Yep.
That part people can just go read, but I appreciate how you're filling in details here around intent. It's not
Yeah.
so it's not correct. Back when people were calling it correction of error, the emphasis is on error, the way we would emphasize problem, defect, like process. It's not correction of the individual, of like, figuratively holding your dog's nose in it when they've not gone outside before, that behavior of rubbing people's faces in the problem. That's not what correction of error,
Yeah.
and that's definitely not what celebration of error would be. But I can see where that word, it's more positive.
It's more
Right?
positive. I mean, I'm trying to set a note of like, hey, I want people to celebrate our errors. Like, I'm really trying to be like on the nose with it, right? I'm not trying to be subtle with it. But
Mhm.
you know, in Lean, we talk about value add and non-value add, and that's another one that curls people's toes when they first get introduced to the value of added. Because I always say 100% of my job, guess what, folks, is non-value add. There's
Right.
no customer that pays to have me here. Like,
Yeah.
it breaks my heart too. This meeting that I'm telling you about, that I'm telling you about value add, non-value, guess what? It's
Yeah.
non-value add,
Right.
right? But in the same way that we have this nomenclature to help us, I love the value add versus non-value add nomenclature and the
Mhm.
necessary versus unnecessary. Like, it is such a powerful framework. It's the
Mhm.
fundamental framework for understanding the world of like how you operate. But from the way you lead, you can similarly have a value add and non-value add. Everything that changes fit, form, or function that changes your employee to lean into learning is value add. Everything else is non-value add. And then it just gets into whether it's necessary or not. And
Right.
so much of process, training, education, templates, they are non-value add, and ideally they're necessary though, but they're really non-value add. They're an artifact. They're a means towards the thing that you really care about, which is a value add, which is moving your employee towards an innovative learning mindset.
Mhm.
And so that's, I think, really important to recognize. These are just tools.
Yep.
They themselves aren't magical. And that's why the adoption of the tools rarely begets the outcomes that you see,
Mhm.
because it's not just what you use, but how you use it that matters.
Right.
It's so important in that. And you can see examples of this. You can think of the recent example of full housing between, is it, I want to say Switzerland, and now it's being readopted into California. I might get the country in Europe wrong, but like they're readopting similar processes in California to help with the housing crisis, in particular with homelessness.
Mhm.
And the reality is it's not going so well in California. And there's a lot of reasons, but a lot of it is because you can't just take these things out of cultural context
Right.
and just mimic the policies and procedures and expect to get the same results. It's no different. It's
Right.
exactly the same problem,
Right.
just at a different scale.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, maybe one last thing we can explore here. I think earlier you mentioned theory X versus theory Y. I'm
Yep.
guessing most anybody listening to this podcast in general, or anyone who's made it this far into our episode, is not a theory X thinker who's been turned
I
off
would
by
hope
all
not.
of this.
I would
But
hope not.
we may have people in the audience who work for somebody who's still kind of clinging
Yes.
to the theory X mindset. Or I could think, Ward, you would not want to go take a job working for a theory X leader. You would
No.
want to figure that out during the
I've
interview.
accidentally I've done that in the past. I've definitely where I didn't think they were a Theory X, but I mean Amazon very Theory X. Manufacturing is sort of classic because I think that comes from that.
Oh,
Reminds me very much of that military, the enlisted versus the officers mindset, right? The whole thing of, and I would say the military is actually far more enlightened nowadays than they were, 40, 50 years ago, but they used to sort of hold to that of, only the officers, which is an analog to only the managers know what to do, and all the folks on the floor, all the people in the trenches just are lazy and don't want to do the work. So, yeah.
I mean, when I was at GM in the 90s, that was Theory X environment and then some. And then seeing, the I've talked about in some episodes here, the newly trained GM plant manager who came in.
Yep.
World of difference with his mindsets, and he wasn't born that way. He had his eyes opened from that experience at NUMMI. But allow me to just role play for a second, kind of Theory X manager.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Again, this is not me saying that, but okay, we're talking about celebration of error. Okay, Ward, if I celebrate errors, I mean that's just going to encourage more. People are going to be sloppy. I mean, don't we need to we need to hold people accountable for errors and their bad performance, right?
Hold them accountable, I think is success is truly not at the individual level, at a group level, and we all have pride of work. I don't think anyone you have to believe, and I do believe people really do want to do their best work. No one is going out of their way. So by celebrating the error, we're celebrating the fact that we had an error. And you got to understand error is an entryway into the one thing that is the most precious commodity at any company is the learning, because the learning is our future and the future is our opportunity. So yes, we want to celebrate those errors. Now, if a person, again, I'll use my good friend Mark, if the person is doing a sabotage, they're doing it intentionally, we'll have that conversation about them sabotaging. But errors in themselves, 99.9999% of the time, is not a sabotage. It is an error, and it's an opportunity to learn.
Yeah, and as you said so well earlier, punishing errors or mistakes, whatever we're going to use, people will learn to get better at hiding them.
Get better at hiding them.
It's this, gosh, I mean, if people think punishing mistakes or the threat or fear of punishment actually reduces mistakes, I don't think they've been anywhere in the real world if they really still hold to that belief, if they've been shielded from the impact of their punishment. Because like you said, we're in agreement here. When we have learning, when we celebrate the mistake, we can have learning, process improvement, mistake proofing. Like it's the non-punitive path that actually, if you were really actually trying to reduce errors, the non-punitive path, I think logically is superior. But again, we're complicated people, humanity. The logical thing doesn't always, right?
Yeah, I always just think about I think we've talked about this before, but I think about the matrix of I know versus I don't know. I call it the fate or destiny, right? So quick definition for the audience, my definition, so the way I use these words. So fate is, I'm not saying these things really exist, but let's just assume you had a fate versus a destiny. A fate is someone other than yourself, three sisters sitting on spindles have decreed what your life is going to be. That's your fate, right? You're sort of a passive participant in this vehicle called life, and it's just going to be what it's be. It doesn't really matter. Free will, throw it out the window, right? That's fate. Destiny is the opposite. It's you stepping in and sort of saying, taking control of that same vehicle and saying, I am going to go here or I'm going to go there. And you have all free will, right? So fate and destiny. And then what decides between those two things in my world, I sort of think about what do I know and what I don't know, and you can break that into a little matrix. And you can sort of say, I know what I know,
Yeah.
which is things that we're talking about right now, right? We've gone and picked up books or talked to other, engaging folks. I know what I don't know. That's the stuff I didn't have that conversation with so and so, so I don't know about, macroeconomics or what have you. And, it's I don't know, I know. That's normally the stuff that, as you and I, Mark, I know we're a little older, with stuff we've forgotten, right? Like we've
Yeah.
learned, but we've forgotten. It's been 20 years, but oh my gosh, yeah, it's in there. It's, it's built in. It's like Prego, it's in there. And then I don't know what I don't know. And that's where fate and destiny come from. That's the decision. And the declination between whether it's going to be fate or destiny is the decision of whether you want to step into your ignorance, which is I don't know, or just let it come to you. And if you just let it come to you, then you're sort of saying errors will be what they'll be. I'm not interested in learning from them. I'm looking to be punitive. I'm guaranteeing you will have your fate given to you. If you're willing to accept your errors as an entryway into that vast world of universe of ignorance, which is a huge black box, and shine a light into it, that is your destiny. And that is where, again, innovation comes from and where improvements come from. That's where our future comes from. So you can decide to be passive and be punitive and sit there and have your fate given to you, or you can be active and open, engaged, and step into and make it your destiny. But that is psychological safety. That's what you're trying to get your employees to, is just say, I don't know most of the time, especially if you're in the innovative. I don't know the answers. It's okay, but I'll figure it out.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if I can go just a little further on this.
Sure.
Because we all like books. You've just written a book, it's getting published. That's amazing. That's declarative knowledge, right? You've turned procedural knowledge, all that hard-earned years, decades, out there in the trenches to figure this out, and you've written it down in a form that another person can come behind you and read it, right? You've taken your procedural knowledge, turned it into declarative knowledge. That's an amazing asset for everyone. Like you and I both have books all around us. I love declarative knowledge. However, we have an over fascination. Not saying don't go buy Mark's book, please go buy Mark's book. But what I'm saying is that we over rely on, in this country in particular, the way our education system is set up, to idolize the printed book as the only true source of knowledge. Yeah. But what we forget, or what we know implicitly, and I want to make it explicit, especially within the Lean community, is that true knowledge is procedural. It is learned hands-on. And if you're going to go down the path, if you hear the hammering, sorry, I'm just getting really excited and hammering on my desk. But if you really want to be innovative, then you're going to do something no one else has done. You're going to be a trailblazer. It means it's going to be procedural knowledge, and you're going to make mistakes because that's how you learn. Yeah. And so if you're not open to that, you're not open to be innovative, you're not open to making improvements, you are just fated to read from someone else's book and follow behind them. You are not a leader in any definition. That's how strongly I feel about this stuff. Like, sorry, because I completely took over the conversation, but like, this is my passion. These are the things I want everyone to understand. And to me, that is the heart. This is the heart of Lean. Yeah. All the rest of the stuff is amazing. We can talk about Andon, we can talk about Kanban, we can talk about, Muda, we can talk about value add and non-value add. All those things are amazing, but those are tools, those are vehicles to help get to this promised land, which is this huge universe of ignorance that we're going to go explore together and find our futures and make our destinies. To me, that is what I love about Lean.
Yeah, I'm with you. Please don't apologize for the passion and the enthusiasm. I share that with you. That's why I wanted you here on the podcast. And I mean, there's the frontiers of innovation, but even process improvement, like in an existing process in a factory or a hospital. I think back to the Toyota people I've been fortunate to learn from, of constantly asking, like, basically sussing out the difference between knowledge and an assumption. And people kind of get tripped up, or if I try to pass along this coaching, if I hear people say, oh, we know the root cause of that problem. Oh, okay, how do you know that? Oh, we talked about it in a conference room and we decided that's the root cause. I'm like, I think what you have there is a hypothesis or an assumption. How do we go test?
Well, you have an assumption. If you were to go run an experiment on that assumption, you could then say you have a hypothesis, right? Yeah. So, but I agree with you. I agree with you so much.
I mean, that and I tried to share some thoughts about this in the book, since you brought it up, the difference between knowledge and assumption, and more often than not, it's a matter of as Rich Sheridan from Menlo Innovation says, run the experiment.
Yep, run the experiment.
Have
And
that bias to that.
I would submit to you, assumptions aren't bad.
No.
What
No.
is bad is implicit assumptions. Explicit assumptions are very valid and very, especially an engineer creating systems. I'm going to assume, I'm going to put it in my requirements doc. I'm going to make this assumption that this is true for now.
Right.
Making it explicit, I think, is very, very important. All my biggest mistakes in my career come from implicit assumptions, where I forgot the challenge and I took something that was an assumption and thought it was knowledge.
Right.
And that is ultimately always, and that's why I just want to make that distinction, is the implicit assumptions are actually the real grenades in the room. And it's always humbling when one of them blows up with you, because you're like, I remember thinking about that and going, I thought that was true. And you're like, nope, that was an assumption. And you thought it was safe not to challenge it. And so go run the experiment, challenge your assumptions, remove the grenades from the room.
That's well said. So I think we'll leave it at that. Our guest today has been Ward Vuillemot. It's always fun talking with you, Ward. I'm going to call out one thing here at the end. A couple of minutes ago, you talked about us being about the same age. You made reference to a Prego spaghetti sauce commercial, I believe.
Yes, sir.
For the younger listeners who don't know that.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's probably an 80s.
It's in there.
It's in there.
Where is that? I'm sure it's on YouTube. Like oregano, it's in there.
Yeah, go look at YouTube. It's probably from some of the VHS tape. You might have remembered those. Before there was streaming, there was VHS tapes. Before that, there was Betamax. And we all know Betamax is better than VHS. Can we agree to that, Mark?
Logically, technically, that seemed to be true.
Yes, but that's the right answer.
Wasn't HD DVD considered better than Blu-ray? But
yeah, that's a good one. I think yes, because I think there's some compression that was put on Blu-ray. I think it's a question of the encoding. now we're geeking out a little bit, but I think it gets down to whether it was encoded or unencoded. And I think a lot of times they would encode on Blu-ray. So I think you're right. I think the HD DVDs, but
that's what I remember.
Don't quote me on that.
I could be wrong.
Someone in the comments will correct us, I'm sure.
But like
you
were saying, I don't know that HD DVD was better. That's my assumption based on a memory.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So again, you can learn more about Ward. WardVuillemot.com. We'll put links in the show notes. Different articles. There was a great piece in Forbes about psychological safety and celebrating errors. That not written by Ward, but quoting him and talking about this approach. I'll share all of that. So this has been great fun. Let's find a topic we can dig into again sometime, Ward.
Yeah, absolutely. And put in the comments in the podcast if there's something you want Mark and I to dig into. I'd love to hear from folks. And do not hesitate to reach out to me. You have the website, Ward Vuillemot. It's in the show notes. You can reach out to me at any time at ward@wardvuillemot.com. Happy to talk to anyone.
That's kinder than making your email Vuillemot@wardvuillemot.com. You might get less spam if you did it that way. I don't know. That's an assumption. All right. Well, thanks again, Ward.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.